A 36-year-old man who still wears the same old military uniform he wore as a captain, who refuses to accept the privileges of power, who has declined the presidential salary, who chooses to live simply, and who every single night is voluntarily protected by hundreds of ordinary citizens sleeping in the open air around his residence. Not because of force, not because of fear, but because of something even more powerful: trust. Or would you believe the endless stream of headlines coming out of major Western newsrooms branding him as Africa's most dangerous man? A ticking time bomb for global order, a rebel in disguise, or worse, without ever stepping foot in his country, without ever speaking to his people, and without ever asking themselves why those who live under his leadership are willing to put their lives on the line for him. I used to believe those headlines too, or at least I didn't question them until I realized that everything I thought I knew about this man, this place, and this movement was filtered through layers of political agendas, selective narratives, and global power plays that rarely tell the full story and never tell it from the inside out. So I decided not to trust the headlines, not to trust the critics, not to trust even my own assumptions, until I had walked the streets of Ouagadougou myself, until I had looked into the eyes of the people who live this reality every day, until I had listened, really listened to their stories, their fears, their hopes, and their reasons for believing in a leader the world insists on fearing, insists on. And when I arrived, what I found was not a country drowning in chaos, but a society quietly rising from decades of exploitation, reclaiming its dignity, one road, one policy, one act of courage at a time. I saw smooth new roads stretching into neighborhoods that used to be impassable mud. I watched traffic cameras catching violators without bias, treating foreign license plates the same as local ones. And I noticed something that caught me off guard. People following rules not because they were afraid, but because they respected the system that was finally working for them. I visited a startup where electric cars are now being assembled piece by piece by young Burkinabe workers who used to dream of fleeing abroad but now see a future worth building at home. And I walked through an apartment complex built in just 2 years, fully sold out, filled with working families paying off their first real homes through local financing, not foreign loans. I sat with a university student who told me almost in disbelief how for the first time in his life he has stable Wi-Fi on campus, how meals in the cafeteria cost just $1, and how if you can't afford tuition right away, the school now offers a system that lets you study first and pay later because the country has finally decided to invest in its own minds. And it was in those small moments, those quiet conversations, that something in me shifted, because I wasn't just seeing progress, I was seeing pride. Not the pride that comes from nationalism or slogans, but the pride that comes from knowing that after years of being told what to do, a people have finally found the courage to choose for themselves. So maybe, just maybe, the real reason the world is afraid of Ibrahim Traoré isn't because he's dangerous, but because he's proof that another model is possible, a model where leaders don't serve foreign interests, where people come before profit, and where sovereignty is more than a word in a speech. And before we go further into this journey, if you believe that the truth matters, if you believe that stories like these deserve to be heard without filters, spin, or silence, then I invite you to hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and stay with me, because in the next few minutes you're not just going to hear about Burkina Faso, you're going to see it, feel it, and maybe, if you're like me, you'll start to question everything you thought you knew about who the world tells us to trust. And if this message resonates with you, if it makes you pause even for a moment, leave a 1 in the comments to let me know you're here. And if not, type 0, because either way, your voice might be the one that keeps this conversation alive. Now, if you're ready, come with me. Let's find out who this man really is. and why a country once dismissed as unstable is suddenly becoming a symbol of African independence, hope, and pride. They called him dangerous. They said he was young, reckless, overly ambitious, and not qualified to lead a nation standing on the edge of collapse. They warned that he was dragging Burkina Faso into darkness, into isolation, and that he would destroy what little stability was left after decades of unrest. His name began showing up in news headlines as something strange, controversial, a man celebrated across parts of Africa, but watched with suspicion in the West. But when I stood in the heart of Ouagadougou on a blazing hot afternoon, watching people go about their daily lives, children laughing in city parks, women riding motorbikes with kids on the back, and soldiers filling potholes with bare hands, I couldn't help but ask myself, have we been asking the wrong question all along? Because in the West, the word dangerous usually means something that threatens us, our markets, our access to resources, our geopolitical balance. But for the people actually living there, dangerous means waking up not knowing if there'll be food on the table or if their child will return home safely from school. Danger is when they live in a land where they have no control over their own future. I'll never forget an old man I met in a dusty little cafe, dressed in a faded shirt, holding a tiny radio in his hand, sipping tea and listening to the morning program. When I asked him if he felt afraid, living under a government that the world describes as dangerous, he smiled gently and said, "Back then, every day I lived in fear. Now at least I know the man in charge hasn't forgotten me." It was a simple sentence, but in that moment, in that place, it held a weight I can't quite put into words. Because sometimes what the world fears is exactly what gives ordinary people a reason to hope. And the first lesson I learned just days into this journey is this: never judge a country by a headline, and never assume someone is dangerous just because he dares to be different. Because maybe, just maybe, that difference is exactly what his people need most. And to truly understand that, we need to go back just a bit to the moment when everything changed to find out why Ibrahim Traoré took power not with a speech, but with a coup that made an entire continent stop and pay attention. There were no gunshots in the streets, no blood on the sidewalks, no tanks rolling through the capital like the kind we often see in the newsreels of coups around the world. The transfer of power in Burkina Faso in 2022 was so quiet, so calm, that it almost felt unreal. And maybe because it was so quiet, it made the world pay even more attention. A young man named Ibrahim Traoré, just 34 years old at the time, a captain in the National Army. Not a politician, not a media figure, and certainly not someone who had ever stood on any campaign stage or sat at any international round table. And yet overnight, he became the face of a movement after declaring the removal of interim president, Paul-Henri Damiba, the very same man who had come to power himself through a coup just a few months earlier. Now you might ask, what on earth is going on in this country where leadership seems to change hands like pages caught in the wind across a desert? But to understand Traoré and the bold decision he made, you first have to understand the suffocating reality that people here were living with day after day. For years, Burkina Faso was trapped in the shadow of terrorism, with armed extremist groups occupying over 40% of the national territory, and the north and east villages were burned. Children stopped going to school. Farmers abandoned their land because walking out to the field could mean never coming home. And worse than all that, people were losing faith in their government because every change of leadership came with new promises. But the results were always the same: gunfire in the distance and ashes where homes used to be. At that time, Traoré was serving in the front lines in some of the most dangerous regions, watching his comrades fall, seeing commanders above him paralyzed by orders. They couldn't defy, afraid to act, because it might upset the so-called strategic alliances with the West. And he said that eventually, if no one was going to change things, then the people at the front would have to do it themselves. One young soldier told me that he was in the same regiment as Traoré, and he remembers the night before the transition, not as a night of war, but as a quiet evening where soldiers sat down together, drank tea, and spoke from the heart about what was broken. And they asked one another a simple question: if we don't do something now, how much longer can this continue? So they acted not for political ambition, but out of a belief that sometimes responsibility does not come from rank, it comes from conscience. And the lesson I took from that is perhaps not about politics, but about courage. That sometimes in life we don't need a high position to make a big change. What we need is a heart strong enough to keep moving forward when we know something is deeply wrong. And because his leadership began from that place of conscience when Traoré took power, he didn't start with grand speeches or promises that sounded too good to be true. He started by doing what no one before him had dared to do. He looked directly at the foreign powers that had influenced this country for decades, and he said, "From now on, we will decide our own future." But that declaration, as powerful as it was, also meant that he had just stepped into the biggest confrontation of his life. No longer just a war against terrorism, but now a quiet battle with international expectations, economic pressures, and foreign influence that has never been comfortable with the idea of an Africa standing tall on its own 2 feet. And to truly understand how that unfolded, we need to look closely at the first major decisions Traoré made after coming to power, decisions that made the political capitals of Paris, Brussels, and Washington glance back at the African map with a discomfort they hadn't felt in decades. Who is Traoré, and why did he refuse to be a traditional president before his name appeared across global headlines, before people started calling him the youngest president in Africa or the new face of anti-Western resistance? Ibrahim Traoré was simply a young man who loved science, someone deeply fascinated with the earth beneath his feet. He studied geology at the University of Ouagadougou, once dreamed of becoming a mineral researcher, traveling far and wide to discover what lay hidden below the surface, where he believed there were not only riches of gold, but layers of history and whispers from the ancestors. But life, as it often does, took an unexpected turn as the country spiraled into chaos, as gunfire echoed through the countryside, as students were forced to choose between textbooks and bullets. Traoré chose to put on a uniform, not to become a hero, but because he felt he could no longer sit and watch while his homeland was being drained, piece by piece, by enemies from outside and neglect from within. And maybe it was that very beginning, coming from the field and not from the parliament, from a young man searching for gold in the ground, not for power in high places, that made Traoré different from anyone who had ever held the seat before him. He didn't move into the presidential palace, didn't live in luxury, didn't ride in motorcades with blaring sirens each time he left the office. People say they often see him wearing the same old military uniform, walking through local markets, checking in with vendors, sitting for tea at small roadside cafes, and many times no one even realizes it's the president, until they look closer and feel something in his presence that speaks louder than titles. A friend of mine in Ouagadougou told me that once, while pushing a broken cart on the side of the road, a jeep stopped beside him. A man in fatigues stepped out and asked if he needed help, then pushed the cart with him all the way to safety. Only later did he realize the man who helped him was the president himself, and when I asked how that felt, he smiled and said, It made me feel lighter, because now I know this country is being led by someone who doesn't live above the people but among them. And that made me think maybe a great leader isn't measured by how often he appears on television, but by how often he quietly shows up when no one is watching. The lesson I took from that moment is this: leadership doesn't begin from a high place. It begins from a real place where a person doesn't stand above the crowd to give orders, but stands within the crowd to understand. And because he came from that real place, Traoré made a decision that many would call irrational. He refused the presidential salary, chose to keep his captain's pay. Because to him, leadership should never be a career for profit. It should be a responsibility born from trust. And when you give up privilege, you send a message, a very clear one, that you owe nothing to those in power, and you are ready to act for those who have no voice. That's why everything he did afterward, from expelling French troops to suspending Western media to turning toward Russia and other anti-Western nations, wasn't just a string of political moves. It was a declaration, a bold announcement of a path chosen freely, even if it was one filled with hardship and stones. And to understand why those decisions sent shockwaves across the world and why Western capitals had to stop and reassess their grip on West Africa, we need to look deeper into the geopolitics of power, into the choices that some call defiant, but that others right here in Burkina Faso call liberation. Why is a land so rich still so poor? If you've ever looked at a mineral map of Africa, you'll notice Burkina Faso gleaming like a rough diamond in West Africa, positioned directly over one of the continent's richest gold belts, stretching from Ghana to Mali. This country is the fourth largest gold producer in Africa, yielding millions of ounces every year. And by all logic, a land like that should be full of schools, hospitals, well-paved roads, reaching deep into the countryside. But the reality is the opposite. Nearly 40% of the population still lives below the poverty line. Many children never go to school. Hundreds of villages lack electricity or clean water, and the people who live closest to the mines still sleep in makeshift shelters of wood and plastic tarps. It doesn't make sense. And that's because this is one of the cruelest paradoxes of modern Africa: poverty, sitting directly atop a fortune that it does not control. Most of the gold mines in Burkina Faso for decades were licensed out to foreign corporations, mostly from Canada, Australia, and France. These companies came in with modern machinery, technical experts, and contracts that on the surface looked like fair partnerships. But in truth, most of the profit went back to their headquarters overseas, leaving Burkina Faso with only a tiny fraction in resource taxes, much of which was lost to corruption and poor governance. A local geologist once told me he worked for nearly 10 years in a mine that reached hundreds of meters deep. And when the foreign company pulled out, they left behind a giant empty pit and an entire generation of workers with no jobs, no support, and no way to survive. What people called investment in the end felt more like a long open wound on the country's body where the blood was drawn but no one stayed to stitch it shut. And what angered Traoré most was exactly what inspired many of the country's youth to support him. They refused to accept a future where their land was stripped of its wealth while their own people went hungry, and they believed the time had come to take back control of what was theirs all along. That's why one of the first things Traoré did after taking office wasn't to speak loudly, but to act clearly. His government began a full audit of all mining contracts, with the goal of gradually shifting ownership to local companies or transparent joint ventures. They purchased equipment-trained engineers and established new regulatory bodies run by Burkinabe professionals. I visited one such site in the south, once abandoned after a foreign firm withdrew, now revived by a group of young engineers who formed a cooperative hiring locals, organizing the work themselves, and slowly bringing life back to the soil. They're not rich yet, not even close. But one thing they said stayed with me. For the first time, we're working, knowing that this gold will feed our children, not someone else's. And I think that may be one of the most powerful lessons any country can learn, whether in Africa or anywhere else in the world. Having natural wealth means nothing unless you control it, unless you decide what happens to the treasure beneath your feet. And if reclaiming control over their own gold was the first thing that made the West uneasy, then the second move was even more jarring. Because what came next was Traoré saying no to old alliances and reaching out to partners the West calls enemies, a geopolitical decision that turned heads, raised eyebrows, and marked the beginning of a new, unpredictable chapter in Burkina Faso's story, which we'll step into next. Not everyone notices, but when a country truly wants to change, it doesn't begin with fortresses or billion-dollar mega-projects. It begins with the smallest things, like a newly paved road into a village, a concrete bridge over a dried-up creek, or the first street lamp lighting up after years of darkness. And that is exactly how Ibrahim Traoré chose to begin his revolution, not with loud slogans, but with the quiet work of fixing broken roads, cracked sidewalks, and potholes no one had touched for years. I remember one early morning we were driving through a quiet suburb of Ouagadougou while the city was still half asleep. We passed a group of young men in plain uniforms. No government logos mixing cement and filling potholes in the street ahead of us. There were no cameras, no officials watching, just sweat, the sound of shovels, and a kind of patience that said more than any speech. The driver leaned over and whispered, "They're part of the rapid response team organized by the government. Each week they pick a neighborhood to repair without announcement. Every stretch of road is a promise." I didn't say anything back, but inside, I felt something shift. Because sometimes trust isn't built through policy or press conferences, it's built through presence in the quiet, ordinary places where people actually live. The new administration didn't stop at fixing roads. They also installed traffic cameras, added functioning lights at forgotten intersections, and most importantly, they enforced the law equally, regardless of who you were. Whether you were a local citizen, a foreign guest, or even a white visitor, everyone had to follow the rules without exception. One story I can't forget is about a Chinese man caught running a red light downtown. Instead of paying a standard fine, he was asked to join the morning public cleanup effort, collecting trash and sweeping the streets. People in the area laughed, took photos, but not out of mockery, simply because it was the first time they saw real equality in action in front of their eyes. A small lesson I learned from that moment was this. Sometimes the shortest road to earning a nation's trust is not appearing on television, but filling the pothole in front of their home. When people begin to see their village roads paved, electricity reaching the narrowest alleys, when children can go to school without wading through muddy paths, when neighborhoods receive street names and real planning maps for the first time, they don't just see physical change, they feel something deeper, a message that says, you are no longer being left behind. But of course, to make that happen, Traoré had to give up a lot. Because foreign aid often comes with conditions, and most of the large infrastructure projects in the past were controlled by international agencies. Choosing to build on their own, to take responsibility, and to source funding internally also meant that Burkina Faso had to gradually step away from old alliances. And that separation opened the door for a series of bold moves in foreign policy, the kind that made not only Paris, but also Brussels and Washington raise their eyebrows and start paying very close attention. And to understand the ripple effects of those moves, we now need to step into the next part of this story, where Burkina Faso's struggle begins to reach beyond its borders and touches the global chessboard in ways no one expected. When Burkina Faso cuts old ties and chooses new partners. Not every nation gets the chance to say enough to the forces that once held it back. But when Ibrahim Traoré came to power, he didn't hesitate to speak those words out loud, and he said them directly to the very powers that for decades believed they had the right to shape Burkina Faso's future. Just weeks after stabilizing the country internally, the new government began taking steps that many in the West considered provocative. They expelled French troops from national territory, terminated long-standing defense agreements inherited from the post-colonial era, suspended French media outlets like France 24 and RFI for interfering in internal affairs, and made it clear that from now on, every foreign relationship would be measured by its value to the people of Burkina Faso, not by old loyalties. No one expected a small, landlocked nation with fewer than 25 million people to stand up so boldly to institutions that were once seen as untouchable. And that is exactly why capitals like Paris, Brussels, and Washington suddenly found themselves confused, even anxious, because they no longer had the compliant partner they had grown used to. At the same time, Traoré began drawing closer to nations often labeled strategic adversaries by the West. Russia, Mali, and Guinea quickly rose as priority partners in military cooperation, technical exchange, and the training of skilled labor. Instead of accepting military aid laced with political conditions, the new administration opted to purchase equipment independently and, more importantly, insisted on technology and knowledge transfer rather than foreign boots or foreign orders. A senior military advisor I met at a closed seminar told me that what Traoré asked for was not free weapons, but the ability to build our own, a decision that revealed one thing clearly: they didn't want to be helped forever, they wanted to learn how to stand. And when I asked an engineering student in Ouagadougou what she thought about partnering with Russia, her reply was quiet but powerful. France has been here for decades and we are still poor. Why not try a partner that doesn't look down on us, that doesn't order us around? And perhaps the most important lesson I took from that is this: true independence is not about rejecting someone. It's about being strong enough to choose who walks beside you. And when a nation dares to stand and choose its partners freely when it breaks away from unequal relationships, even knowing the backlash it may face, that moment is more than just political strategy. It becomes a declaration of self-respect and a commitment to take ownership of its destiny. But what surprised me most wasn't the signing of defense memorandums or the diplomatic realignments. It was how the people of Burkina Faso responded to these changes, not with chants or demonstrations, but with their bodies, their presence lining the very roads that lead to the presidential compound. And to understand why hundreds of ordinary citizens are willing to sleep outside each night under the open sky just to protect their president, we need to go deeper into something many have begun to call the human shield. A phenomenon almost unheard of in modern African politics, and one that leads us directly into the next chapter of this story. If there's one moment in Burkina Faso that truly left me speechless, it wasn't a policy announcement, a rousing speech, or a grand ceremony. It was the sight of hundreds of ordinary people, single mothers, bricklayers, students, even retired soldiers who each night rolled out mats and hung mosquito nets to sleep along the sidewalks near the presidential compound in silence, without protest, without demand. They call it the living wall, the people's shield, a form of protection for their leader that you won't find in any political textbook, not because anyone told them to do it, not because there was a reward, but because they believe that if someone is risking his life to protect them, they should be willing to protect him in return simply by being there. I walked among them on a moonless night. The air was cold, but no one moved inside. An older man handed me a cup of hot tea, smiled, and said, "I lost my son to terrorism, but now I believe someone is really trying to stop it from happening again. So I'm here." At another corner, a group of young men strummed guitars and softly sang a song they had written about freedom and courage. No one ordered them to show up, but they did, night after night, sending a quiet message to the world. We chose this leader, and we will not let anyone touch him. In that moment, I realized something simple. A true leader is not someone surrounded by metal barricades, but someone surrounded by people who choose to stand beside him out of trust. That kind of trust doesn't come from flashy speeches. It comes from presence when people see you walking the same streets. They walk, eating the same food they eat, caring about the small things like whether there are enough chairs in a classroom or whether the street light turns on each night. I once asked a young woman sitting by the gates of the compound, mending a shirt under a flickering light, if another government replaces Traoré tomorrow, would you still be here? She shook her head gently and said, I'm here because this one is real, not pretending. That sentence stayed with me for a long time, because in a world where politics so often feels like theater, maybe what people truly need is someone who doesn't act, someone who just shows up and stays true. And perhaps that authenticity, that refusal to perform, is the greatest strength a leader can ever have. The small lesson I carried away from those people sleeping under the stars is this. When trust is not bought, when support for a leader becomes a daily action and not just a chant, no outside force can easily shake that nation. And in that quiet, unwavering presence, I saw why Burkina Faso, for all its struggles, still holds something that not every nation does. A hope born from within its people, steady, silent, like a flame that keeps burning in the long night. And maybe now it's time to reflect on this journey to ask one final question. Is Traoré just a moment, or is he the beginning of something much larger, not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent? There's something I always carry with me when I travel across different parts of Africa, a feeling that is both familiar and unfamiliar. Familiar in the warm smiles, the soft voices, the honesty that shows without hiding, but unfamiliar because every nation, every community, every story carries its own deep scars. Scars that don't always show on the skin, but live in memory, where unfair treaties were signed in black ink and red blood, where generations were forced to live by rules they didn't write. And on this journey through Burkina Faso, what moved me the most was not just the policies, but the way ordinary people were slowly beginning to rewrite a new chapter for themselves. Without waiting for approval, without needing permission, they were writing it with their own hands. In every road that was rebuilt, every classroom that was expanded, every decision that no longer needed a nod from the West to feel legitimate. A local friend once told me, people look at us through headlines and think Africa is only conflict and poverty. But they never see the most important part. We are bravely choosing ourselves again. That sentence made me fall silent. Because it's true, history is not something set in stone by skin color or by a past full of occupation. It's the ongoing process of each generation standing up, looking at reality, and daring to say, we will write our story in our own language. Ibrahim Traoré may just be one man, a soldier, a young leader with an idea. But what makes him different is not what he's fighting against. It's what he believes in. That his people deserve to choose their own path, to own their own resources, to decide their own friends and partners, without having to trade obedience for that right. And maybe it's that very spirit, the courage to begin again, that makes the world uncomfortable, because a small country that dares to rise up can inspire a whole continent where the dreams of independence are still unfinished. I don't know where Burkina Faso will go next. There will be mistakes. There will be setbacks. There will be challenges much bigger than they've ever faced. But I'm sure of one thing. They've chosen to begin from a place of truth, of trust, and from the hands of people who once thought they had no power. And when history is no longer written for you, but by you. That's not just change. That's awakening. If you're still here, thank you for walking this journey with me. A journey not just into the heart of Burkina Faso, but a reminder that real transformation doesn't need magic. It only needs one person to start and a nation to follow. And if you believe that everyone everywhere deserves to rewrite their own story, no matter where they begin, then leave a sign below, because your small message might just be the reason someone somewhere far away decides to stand up and choose themselves again. Some fires begin with the smallest spark, and while people are still arguing over whether it will burn out or grow somewhere else, other sparks quietly begin to glow, rising not with noise but with persistence, impossible to extinguish. To many international analysts, Burkina Faso once appeared to be an outlier, a small, restless nation full of risk, one that dared to cut ties with the West, to challenge the order that had long been taken for granted. But as Ibrahim Traoré's decisions began to spread, it wasn't just the people of Burkina Faso who paid attention. Neighboring nations that had long shared the same legacy of dependency began to stir. Mali, Niger, and Guinea, three countries previously labeled as weak in democracy, became the first to reach out not in protest, but in partnership. They didn't just offer moral support, they signed real agreements, from joint military efforts to collaborative frameworks for food security and even shared currency. In September 2023, the announcement of the Sahel Alliance was made. A quiet move, but one filled with meaning. Not just a defensive pact, but a political statement that said, "We, the nations once underestimated, will no longer wait for permission from outsiders to shape our own future." I spoke with an independent journalist in Bamako, the capital of Mali, who told me, "We're not following Traoré because he's anti-France or anti-America. We're following him because he dared to do what most African leaders only think about: step out of the safe zone built by someone else." And perhaps that's the most important lesson this wave is bringing. That real power doesn't come from growing strong alone, it comes from the weakest daring to stand together. When one country breaks its chains, that's a beginning. But when several countries together create a new system, one built on mutual respect, shared risk and leadership that does not seek to dominate, but to protect, then we're no longer talking about rebellion. We're talking about the birth of a new order. And now people no longer look at Burkina Faso as an anomaly. They see it as one of the first seeds of a new generation of African leadership. One that does not emerge from the elite circles of Paris or London, but from the soil, the people, the everyday reality on the ground. And as the entire Sahel region begins to redraw the map of power, the question is no longer just for Burkina Faso, or even for Africa. It is for the whole world. Will we choose to watch, to resist, or to walk alongside those bold enough to rewrite the very meaning of independence?